We're looking forward to sharing the book of Haggai with you this year at EQUIP23. The Old Testament feels a little bit unfamiliar for lots of us, and so I've got Di Warren here with me, and we're going to have a chat together about some of the things that might help you engage with the book of Haggai. So Di, one of the things that I've heard, it's almost like a rule, is that the Old Testament was not written to us, but it was written for us. So let's unpack that a little bit. Who was the book of Haggai written to?
The book of Haggai was written to God's people in the Old Testament in the year 520 BC. Now, to give you a bit of context, I've got to go back to 1000 BC, which is the high point of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
That was when all of God's promises seemed to have come true. They were God's people, they were in God's place, and they were under God's rule. So you think about, they had the promised land, they had the city of Jerusalem, they had the temple where God dwelt, they had the priests and King David and Solomon. So that's the high point.
Yep.
Looks like everything's there, which of course is why it's so devastating in 587 BC, which is the low point in Israel's history.
Lamentations.
Then Lamentations, exactly. Babylon comes in and ransacks the city, destroys the temple, and carries the people off to Babylon. 587 BC. Now then in 538 BC, something extraordinary happens. There's a Persian king, Cyrus, and he says that God's people can go back to build a temple in the promised land. Now why does he say that? Well, Ezra 1 verse 2 is really interesting. It says, Cyrus says, God has appointed me, that is the pagan king, Cyrus, to build him a temple in Jerusalem. So naturally he sends back God's people and saying, okay, get on and build the temple. And that brings us to 520 BC, about 18 years later. And God is basically saying to the people, okay, you've come back to build the temple. Why is it that you're not building the temple now?
So that's like, the Bible's one big story. So that's the historical context of where we're up to. But there's a theological kind of background to this story as well, isn't there? How would you think about that?
Probably the easiest way to think about it is the covenants in the Old Testament, of which there are 3 that are really big ones. A covenant is sort of describing how the relationship with God is going to work. So we know God promises, I'm going to be your God and you're going to be my people. Yeah. And there's different ways that sort of unfolds through the Old Testament. So firstly, there's the Abraham covenant. So you read about that in Genesis 12. And God basically says, I'm going to bless you. And he gives a few details about how he's going to bless them. And he also says, whoever blesses you will be blessed, but if someone curses you, they will be cursed. So that's the Abraham covenant. Then we get to Deuteronomy, the Deuteronomy covenant around Deuteronomy.
They've entered the promised land.
When they've entered the promised land, about 28 to 30. So I think the old, the 10 Commandments and Mount Sinai. And in there in chapter 28, God says, actually he draws closer to actually explaining the relationship of him to the people. And he says, now, if you obey me, you'll be blessed, but if you disobey me, you'll be cursed. So this idea of blessing and cursing is not just how people outside treat God's people, but actually God's people themselves, how they treat God.
Yeah, and if you read those chapters, I think you'll find lots of things that echo with what you're going to read in Haggai.
Absolutely,
yeah.
and sort of Haggai in some ways moves from cursing to blessing by the end. So that's the second covenant, the Deuteronomy covenant. And then we get another big one, which is the David covenant. And that's around 2 Samuel 7. And that's the idea that from David's family, King David, there's going to be a descendant who will be on the throne. In fact, there'll be an eternal king that will come from King David. So the Abraham covenant, the Deuteronomy covenant, the Davidic covenant or the David covenant. All of those covenants together are describing somehow all the promises that are coming to God's people. And so when we get to Haggai, you get little echoes of all those covenants there in the text.
Something else that I think I've noticed is, so in terms of background, there's also kind of a theme running in the Bible of God with us.
Yep.
So Haggai is not the first time that we hear about that.
Yep.
all the way back to Genesis?
Yeah, totally, because, I mean, they're physically, well, we read that, God actually walked in the garden with Adam and Eve. So we get the idea of, God with his people right from the beginning.
Beautiful, intimate picture, actually. Isn't
Beautiful picture, obviously lost then in Genesis 3 to some extent. They're now leaving the garden, but that's where the covenants pick up, really, saying, because you're asking the question, well, now we're not in the Garden of Eden, what is it going to look like to relate to God? And he defines that relationship as the covenants unfold. But as we go through the Old Testament, there's this idea that God's with his people first. There's the tent as they're wandering through the wilderness. The tent of meeting, and that sort of grows into this idea of the temple by the time they get to the promised land with King David. So the temple becomes really, really important. That's where God dwells with his people. And of course, if you stretch into the temple, the innermost part, the most holy place, was very, very important. God's throne room, his dwelling place.
So that's why Lamentations is so devastating.
It's so devastating because, you've had the temple, this is where God dwells, and then, the temple's gone away, which is why when you go back to the promised land, it's so important that they would rebuild the temple.
Okay, so we've had a little bit of thinking about the background, and I really encourage you to read some of those chapters, Genesis 12, Deuteronomy 28 to 30, and 2 Samuel 7, if you're not familiar with those kind of themes. So what does the book of Haggai, what does the message look like?
Well, the message looks like 4 prophecies. So, I mean, prophecy, interesting to us, we sort of think that probably means, God says to Haggai, this is what I want you to say to the people. And sort of it's like that, but there's interesting little bits of history in there. And even in the third prophecy, it's actually speaking to the priests directly and having a conversation with them. Anyway, so there's 4 prophecies and they're over 3 days, which is sort of interesting. So day 1 is prophecy 1.
Yep.
Day 2 is prophecy 2. Day 3 is prophecy 3 and 4. So I think they've got to be read together as a little set. Now we've got the dates of them all. So basically day 1 is, Haggai says it's the first day of the 6th month in 520 BC. I've got it here. If we do the translation.
I know, we can actually date
where have we got
right?
it? I've got it here somewhere. It's the 29th of August, 520 BC.
Yep.
So that's the first one.
Yep.
The first prophecy. Then we have the second prophecy, which comes on the second day, and that is the 21st day of the 7th month, 520 BC. I got it again. That is the 17th of October.
So they're quite close together.
Very close together. Then there's a little bit more of a gap. So the day 3, which is when the third and the fourth prophecies come, that is the 24th day of the 9th month, 520 BC, which is 18th of December.
So it's a very short window, actually,
exactly,
for the book of Haggai.
Absolutely, all in that year, 520 BC, but little gaps between this special word that comes to Haggai for the people, and even a little bit special who it says they're directed to each one. So the first one actually says literally it's directed to the governor Zerubbabel, Jewish governor, and to Joshua the high priest. Next one says the same 2 people. The second prophecy, but also tucks in the remnant of the people. Then the third one is actually to the priests, and then the fourth one to Zerubbabel. So, I mean, holistically, it seems to be to Zerubbabel and to, they're the representatives, Zerubbabel and the high priest of the people, but a little bit interesting details how it unfolds when we read it.
And that the third and fourth prophecy actually happen on a special day as well, don't they?
Exactly, it tells us, doesn't it? Yeah, so they've been told to rebuild the temple, and this is the day that the foundation of the temple.
It's a very significant day for them.
Very significant day, yeah.
Oh, okay. So in terms of prophecy, even though you're saying there's all these different things about it, but does have a general shape of pushing us forward, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's all these different interesting themes, and you've got to sort of ask as you're reading it, these different prophecies, how do they all go together, somehow interlink? Because I think when you first read it, they seem a little bit different, some of the themes, but somehow they fit together. But what they do in common is push us forward. So you get to the end of Haggai and you're asking, how does this all come about? And so it pushes you forward ultimately to the New Testament and to Jesus.
So in thinking about us, I think that is the wonderful thing, isn't it? That all those Old Testament promises that God makes, they're all yes in Christ, right? He fulfills them all uniquely. So as we come to the book of Haggai, what do you think we can expect to learn?
I think there's probably two main things as I've been reading it. So the first one is I think it helps us to reflect on our sin, because there's a little phrase that runs all the way through, which is consider your ways. It comes up in the first prophecy, and as the book goes on, we see it again. So there's a sense, a call for reflection, which is a bit hard in a busy world if we're not good at just slowing down and actually, but that's what God says to the people, consider your ways. Yep. But the second one, I think, would be reflecting on God's presence. Because when we get to Oracle 2, there's a really interesting line there about God being with his people. It's actually like Joshua. He says, don't be afraid, be strong because I'm with you. And that's the idea of the temple as well. So I think as we read Haggai, we're actually reflecting on what it is for God to be with his people. And again, actually Oracle 3 is interesting because there's a problem with defilement. So you're left pushing forward, trying to work out how is God with his people and what exactly is the temple.
Thanks, Di. I hope that's whet your appetite for the book of Haggai. Make sure that you download our manuscript discovery that has some questions that will help you keep reading the text carefully so that you'll be ready to hear the talks. See you on Saturday, June 17.